Lina's project deals with the intersection of misinformation, not only as an informational genre, but also as an accusatory label and a perceptual phenomenon. It investigates how talking about misinformation and having different ideas about it shapes informational uncertainty in online spaces. Lina's talk today is titled, "What is Misinformation to You? An Audience-Centered Approach to Misinformation Perceptions." So take it up.
Thank you. Also, thank you that like all of us can see it tonight. It's super nice. I wasn't expecting that. I just had the longest call with the company of this, and my brain is super fried, so it's probably going to get very entertaining for you. And I also then would have put more effort into nice slides, but here we are. So yes, my whole dissertation, I have actually presented the first part of it last year in the Hot Politics Suck, so thanks for having me again. Deals with introducing new problems to the misinformation crisis instead of finding solutions, really, is something that I had to acknowledge. I wonder, what is misinformation to you, but also to the average citizen? Why? Because there is a great deal of worry when it comes to misinformation in academia, but also in public discussions. But I was kind of wondering, how much of it do we actually see on a day-to-day basis? And there's very little research yet, comparatively, on the perceptions of people. And I'm just going to go into my thought process, how I got to this idea, because I've been working on this project since September last year. And we still haven't started the data collection, so I'm sorry about that, which is due to the method, which was hard to approve, which you will learn about in a bit. But maybe some of you who are interested in this information have seen this already. So the World Economic Forum determined the disinformation as the most important global risk of 2024, at least when it comes to short-term risk. Long-term, it's still climate change, I think. And when we ask people around the world, we can also see that, across multiple years, also before COVID, but also now after COVID-19, everyone in the world is worried about misinformation, specifically worried about being able to distinguish true from false information in online spaces. So by far more than half are worried or very worried. And this differs by country. So there are countries like Brazil who definitely skew these numbers up a little bit. And the Netherlands has rather comparably low numbers of misinformation worries. But if we look at academic studies, we see that, at least according to the few content and domain analyses we have on larger scales in different Western democracies, misinformation supposedly only makes up a small share of our news diets. I mean, there's one outlier here of 6%, but the table is also much longer. I just didn't have the space for it, but it was always between the 0.1 and 6% was the highest in the US. Researchers don't always find as much misinformation regarding the, in comparison to the worries that we observe. So is there some sort of a discrepancy between perceptions and the actual share of misinformation? So I kind of want to explore, why do some academics say there is not much, but on the other hand, everyone is so worried? And I kind of want to tackle the academic side of this, right? The first reason could be we as academics don't see much of the misinformation. So when we further look into the digital news report, people are most worried about Facebook and WhatsApp when it comes to platforms in which misinformation is shared. And these kinds of platforms are often not accessible to us as researchers, specifically when it's private groups where, I don't know, the aunt shares fake news with us. At the same time, we also talk a lot about disinformation and misinformation. I use them a bit interchangeably here, which is not what we're supposed to do. I tend to say misinformation as sort of an umbrella term because I do want to focus on the definitions of audiences. But we do talk about it a lot, whether it be educational discourse from the media talking about misinformation or fake news accusations. And also it is very popular in politics. This is just one survey question we had where we asked people specifically how often they observe politicians of accusing specifically the media of bias and lying. And only for this kind of specific aspect of misinformation, disinformation, accusations, a lot of people seem to see it every now and then. And this is also what I had observed in my first study, that in public discourse, there are a lot of references to supposed factual inaccuracies. And the most interesting reason to me personally is, do we have different ideas about misinformation? This is rather small, actually, I see now, but I just have multiple examples. So all across the academic literature, we see that mis and disinformation has slightly different definitions, also in these domain analyses I was presenting earlier. Often mis and disinformation is seen as sort of a spectrum of deception. Like here, it ranges from, it says, oh, you don't see that. On the left, it says from satire or parody to fabricated content, or here there's even like this dimensional space of the intention and the level of facticity. According to this, disinformation has a lower level of facticity than misinformation, but in most languages, for example, in Dutch and German, which is also going to be my sample, we don't distinguish between mis and disinformation. We just use Desinformation, Desinformatie. So even in the literature, there is a little bit of ambiguity when it comes to these concepts. And the question is, if it's a spectrum, where do we draw the cutoff line, right, from true to false? Because when we use, when we do domain or content analyses, so measure exposure essentially to mis and disinformation, the domains are either coded as fake news or not. So there's often a predefined list of sources that are considered fake news and some that are not, and then it's coded as either or. Or when we use experiments, we test the effect of the true condition, the false condition, or the presence or the absence of a fact check to a true or a false fact, or the presence or absence of a literacy intervention. So it has to be black and white, and I don't want to call that wrong, because obviously we also need pragmatism, we also need progress. But sometimes, and considering the ambiguities before, I started to wonder, do we hand people these tools like literacy interventions, like fact checks, but do people actually apply the tools to the kind of information that we assume they would apply them to, if that makes sense? There's a little bit of qualitative work in which people from different countries have suggested that they cannot distinguish opinions from facts anymore. And this is also something I observed in my first study back then, that often inaccuracy is assigned to content that is disliked by a public figure. So your opinion is wrong, essentially. Or statements like fake news are propagated by the outgroup. But again, this is not representative, but fits well to the narrative I want to present today. So why is perception research super interesting? Instead of the other studies that we have that focus on predictors or effects of believing in misinformation, the perception research focuses on those people who identify misinformation as false because they do not believe in it, because they spot it as being false. And this is actually relatively understudied.
A couple more minutes, and then you can keep going, but it would feed into your Q&A.
Oh, yeah, I don't have data to present, so, but thank you. Sorry, next year. So the mere belief of the prevalence of misinformation can predict negative outcomes already. So yeah, I think I've said most of this. I want to understand, why is there an ambiguous success when it comes to these interventions? What are the different sources, kinds of information that are prevalent in misinformation according to audiences? And do their ideas of misinformation align with our academic information definitions, is the word, at all? So what do citizens regard as mis and disinformation? How do they identify it? And there's also more, but yeah, maybe I should look at the time a little bit. In order to find this out, I'm not going to give people specific definitions of mis and disinformation, because that would defeat the purpose. Instead, I'm using the four most common terms in the Netherlands, in the Dutch language and the German language, which translate to disinformation, fake news, false or misleading information, these four terms. And I ask people to send it to me whenever they see it in this, what I think is a really cool design. So it is an experience sampling method. which essentially means you ask people about an event of interest, which for me are misinformation encounters, in the context of it happening. It's really difficult to do that, I find. So that is why I'm doing it via WhatsApp, which is really cool. So essentially, it's going to be 9 days. We're going to have an intake survey on day 1 and an exit survey on day 9 that captures, all variables that are irrelevant to time. So all sorts of control variables, but also general misinformation perceptions, so that I can ask people the day before and the day after they pay attention to the informational environment, how much they think they see, and see whether just tasking them to pay attention to it can actually affect their misinformation perceptions. But the heart and soul of this study will be that participants are tasked to take a screenshot of misinformation every time they see it in online spaces. And then they are going to submit it to WhatsApp, which then triggers a survey, follow-up survey in WhatsApp, asking about threat perceptions in terms of this misinformation encounter, how confident they are that it is wrong, how wrong they think it is, but also an open question that asks how they came to the conclusion that it is wrong. To control as well as possible, if people follow these instructions, I also have one fixed signal, one fixed survey at the end of the day, every day, in which I ask about social media use and media use on that day, and also how accurate their submissions or lack thereof was when it comes to their actual exposure, highlighting that it doesn't affect their rewards at the end of the day. And then on the last day, we are going to repeat some of the measures from day 1, again, seeing if tasking people to pay attention to misinformation for 1 week can alone affect their perceptions. Maybe they think, whoa, I've overstated the worry or overstated my idea of how often I encountered it. So that is kind of its own interesting study in this. But also just give the opportunity to reflect a little bit. Again, there will be a lot of open questions. That is the nice thing about this WhatsApp thing, because they can respond with voice notes. That's really cool. And hopefully there's a way to respond for every generation. My grandma would probably not send a voice note, but she would send a short reply. That is the design. If there is any input or criticism, I'm happy to hear it. And I'm happy to also present hopefully the data maybe next year, next academic, or at the end of the academic year. Shouldn't take that long. But that's it. Thanks.
Okay, we have around 50 minutes for questions. Feel free to just raise your hand. Lina?
I have a question about the instructions you give them. I know you went through them, but not sure if I understood them properly. Do you think it's an issue that people might fall into this rabbit hole and go on a whole active search? Are you only interested in incidental, or is it also okay, or maybe even wished for or desirable if they actually actively look?
No, so I don't. The instructions very clearly highlight that I don't want them to seek it out. It's a bit difficult with the reward structure at the end of the day. So you kind of rely on them being interested in the study, I guess. But no, the goal is really to keep it to the organic encounters. I also tell them, if you usually fact check information and that's how you get to the conclusion that's wrong, please do so. If you don't do it usually, please don't do it now. You will have the opportunity to tell me that you're unsure if it's true or false, for example. I'm curious to see how compliance will be. But that's why I have this control survey at the end of the day that essentially asks, hey, whatever you submitted or didn't submit today, is this an accurate reflection of what you actually saw and didn't see? Please be honest, this does not affect your reward, but
Thanks. It's a really cool design. Yeah, thanks.
Sorry, Lina, can you go back to the other slide that you were showing?
Which one?
It's the previous, Okay, because I'm also on one part thinking that these days of looking and filtering through possible disinformation might also make them might make it more salient to them. So in a way, the experiment itself could be almost like an intervention where
Yeah.
throughout time, maybe they will be more sensitive to noticing
Yes.
things that could be disinformation.
Yes.
And I was wondering about the accuracy assessment of true, false, and opinion-based statements. Is this based on other data that you give them at the end, or is it based on the stuff that they find?
Yeah, so I also, this is not my measure technically, but I also give them more of a binary true false and then one of these gray area statements as part of this waddle typology. So I quote unquote manipulate, but it's not an experiment because everyone sees all of them, but manipulate the same statement into different gray areas of factual inaccuracy. And just to, yeah, cool. And it's also, to be fair, it's at the end because there was no more space in there.
That's cool.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think this is a really cool design, but I think it's a bit undersold by the story you have before it. I didn't understand your point about that there's no research on perceptions of disinformation.
Not no, but less.
It's understudied, but everything is understudied. I think there's actually a lot of work on this. I mean, there are all these tasks where people need to say, is this true or false?
Yeah.
This might be slightly different, but I think it ties into this. And but what you're after is sort of a more grounded way of identifying what people consider to be misinformation, and then you can use these different 4 bullet points here to map the variation in misinformation. But thinking in this way, I also thought, don't you also need examples of no misinformation?
Yes, and we actually, I don't have it on the slide yet, but we do have in this, we just added that yesterday. But it's a very good point. Once per day at night, we ask for a baseline true information that was seen that day. I just didn't think that anyone would think it is interesting, so I didn't add it anymore.
Yeah, because there could be misinformation in that, but they
Yeah.
don't consider it misinformation. But you do want to have that information or to see what the difference is between what they do consider misinformation.
Yes.
So I think it's actually a crucial component.
Yeah, okay. That's good to know because I didn't think that I would incorporate that first. But now that I think about it, but also, first of all, your point on perceptions is a good point because then maybe that's terminology. I think perceptions in the sense of this bottom-up approach. So not giving people things already and saying, is this now true or false, but really just like the what is out there. So I should work on that probably. But yeah, fair. Yes, I just find it hard to, how to use this as a baseline, I guess. But it will, because I will code this. I will probably design my own code book based on the first 100 submissions or so, or whenever saturation is reached. And maybe this can then also be applied to the true information so that you can at least see the sources and map that out a little bit. Yeah. Thanks.
Yeah, I think it's very interesting.
Thank you.
First of all, I think it's really good to focus on perceptions because, as you said, like confronting them already with ready-made content is sometimes confusing. I was wondering whether you're going to distinguish the mode of consumption. Are people consuming it on their phone, laptop, or paper-based? Because I know from my personal experience that I don't that I encounter a lot more information when I'm on my laptop than when I'm on my phone because I use the closed off, for me as I'm Dutch, the NOS application. And on my laptop, I get to some weird
To Facebook or
yeah. Like I encounter it more.
Yeah.
And I was wondering, like, I think you were intending to use screenshots.
Yes, or photos, I guess. Right now, the only way of differentiating would be to see if people took a photo of their desktop screen. But then I guess you can also take a screenshot of your desktop screen and send it to your phone and then send it to WhatsApp. But I would hope that,
Generational things, maybe, right?
this is only for 30 and under.
Yeah.
No, but that's a good point actually, because haven't programmed this yet, the whole infrastructure into WhatsApp, so this is maybe something to consider.
Yeah.
Is it, I'm just gonna type on my. It's not me being rude, and I'm just writing down also what Kai said, if that's okay.
Yeah, sure.
Yeah, do write that down.
As said by Kai Schumacher. Okay.
Yeah, thanks, Lina. I really like the study design and I think it has a lot of potential for us to learn more about this. I mean, the causal part has been kind of well studied, but the perceptions is having a bigger gap. And so I think the study will shine a lot of light on this. At the same time, the table you showed, right, between 1% and 6%.
Oh, yeah.
Does seem to suggest that at least the absolute volume of misinformation among I don't know who these 500 people will be,
Yeah.
but that might be looking for a needle in a haystack in a sense among these 500 people. So if you're really
1,000 doesn't, but yeah.
yeah, but still, right, with 1%, and
Yeah.
then it's gonna.
Yeah.
So my question is, are you really interested in finding the misinformation, or you actually don't care? And is it more about what the people perceive?
Yeah.
And then it might just all other, because if you really want to go after this,
Yeah.
you might need to select these people in some way. I mean, Andy Guess had some work, was it older people or so? I mean, there's some, whether it's the older or the younger or men or women or
Yeah.
whatever, like there's, or people that say something. So that's my question.
Yeah, it's a great question, and it also shows how I don't know what I was thinking using this as a dissertation project in which you have to write about something eventually. Because so what I expect is that out of the 1,000 people, maybe 300, 400 will maybe not submit anything, even if they comply. And there will be 90 to 100 people that send me probably 100 screenshots in a week. This is also by I wanted to give credit also to Dominique Wirth, who presented something similar here last year and really sparked that idea. And that is kind of the distribution that she also found. So it is really, and from a pragmatic point of view, my plan B for also having, because I also need a paper at the end of the day for my dissertation, is to see whether this functions as some sort of an intervention as well. So do people really see that much, or do they also overestimate their exposure? And yeah,
To get at that, you need to build in a few randomizations, I think. Like randomly ask people one day to do misinformation, the other day normal news.
I get a little already out of control here. Yeah, I can.
Yeah, but also with the terminology, right? Misinformation and net news. Like net news is much easier for Dutch people than misinformation. So I would.
Yeah, they get all 4 terms. What? Because because I had this. So I'm gonna ask them if you see this /that/that/that, all 4, which is also I mean, I'm happy if you have like a good idea to solve this, because I'm also not a fan. It makes questions very long as well. But the question is that not everyone knows what disinformation is. And then you also want to capture maybe the gray area. So misleading information is also somewhat important. So that was how we decided to solve this, but I find it very difficult.
You could ask a question like, so you have all 4 in this question.
Yeah.
But then you would add another question when they upload it to say which one of the 4 do you think it is?
Yeah.
But then what if I confuse them because they thought it was all the same?
But they can select, for example, multiple in the worst case.
That's actually a really nice idea, Philip. I really like that. Thanks. Yeah, because that's obviously. So in German we also say fake news. We don't have a German equivalent to net news or fake news. It is of course a term that's much more politically charged than Desinformation. Cool, thanks.
Still a lot of questions, but not a lot of time, so keep the question short. I'm also going to switch it up because we said that we are also going to prioritize a little bit student and PhD student questions. So yeah.
It's not a question, thank you. I just wanted to know.
Would include me as well.
Great. Just with, different types of media consumption, have you thought about, screenshots of like YouTube videos or like if it's audio, like how you're gonna handle that? At least in my head, when I've encountered it, that's more the platforms that comes to mind for me.
Yeah. Also very good, very important question. So I do ask, because we also have to ask people to anonymize the screenshot. So if it's a YouTube video of a person that's not considered a public figure, they're not even allowed to technically upload the name of the channel as well. It may happen, but then I have to remove it. So I do ask them about the platform and the source, first of all, so to at least know where it's coming from, for sure. And then when it comes to the content, I do ask, how did you come to the conclusion that you think that this is false? So this, I expect people to say, because this person only talks shit, or because he or she said that, and then gives me sort of a quote, or so I kind of have to deduce it from that. This design, it's super cool, but it does come with so a lot of risks, in the sense that I try to account for as many issues as possible beforehand. I'm probably overlooking a bunch of them still, and I can't really expect what is coming. So yeah, but I'm trying to capture it like that as good as possible, as well as possible.
Maybe a short final question, we need to jump and maybe instead of the second presentation.
And,
Or don't, but
yeah, thinking about time, I will skip Gerrit's happy birthday song.
Maybe afterwards.
Maybe that comes afterwards. Yeah, but super happy to be here. Like Delaney said, I'm Lina Bomm. I started my PhD here at the lab almost exactly a year ago, actually. I'm studying societal threat perceptions and their associations with political attitudes and behavior. And today I'm going to be presenting the current stage of a paper I'm writing with Bernd and another co-author, Paul Bergman, which kind of really just started as a little investigation of data we already had and that we were already working with. And yeah, that is now kind of starting to become a paper, but it's still very much work in progress. That means, short disclaimer, both that the plots are fresh off the press or fresh off of our since as of yesterday, and that I'm very open for feedback or advice that you have on the project. Right, so today I'll be talking about how threat is not just issue salience. First of all, I want to talk about why we should study threat. And if you've been around in the lab for a little longer, you've heard me talk about this before, both in an official talk and privately a few times. So the world can be a threatening place. We've got lots of issues around that can be perceived as threatening, such as climate change, economic crises, international violent conflicts, but also pandemics, and also the rhetoric around those issues that frames these issues as threats, and that can also potentially drive threat perceptions. And we also see that people are indeed threatened. Lina, I find it funny that you had the risk report of the World Economic Forum on your first stage, so I'm citing that as well. When I say that 63% of citizens worldwide expect upheavals and an increased risk of global catastrophes over the next 10 years. So people are indeed threatened. And well, that can also be a productive thing, a good thing. Being threatened by climate change makes it more likely that you adapt pro-environmental behaviors, and being threatened by such a thing as a pandemic makes it more likely that you take up the vaccine to protect yourself against it. But at the same time, threat also fuels support for anti-democratic policies. It can drive polarization. It can even lead to violence. And there's, well, recently researchers have been arguing for it also affecting physical and mental health, as for example, Delaney's study. Right, so we've got lots of research on the potential consequences of threat. And we also have a lot of research associating threat with public opinion and political ideology. We have lots of theories around the causes of threat. But I also want to ask, what is threat? And if you're wondering why that slide comes after the why study threat slide, well, that's kind of how you encounter it in the literature a lot of times. We have all these theories built on threat, but do we know enough about its validity or about its construct validity? This is kind of what we're tackling here. So in our context, threat is the perception of potential harm or danger posed by an issue or stimulus. So we're assessing some form of public opinion, a form of attitude, some would say an emotion towards different stimuli. But another common way of assessing attitudes towards these stimuli is asking about issue salience. So the significance that individuals attach to an issue, or also concern, the worry about an issue. These are all constructs that are around in literature already today, that are also sometimes used as proxies for threat. And this is where it really becomes problematic. We've got entire threat theories arguing that threat is its own thing, it's special, it's different, we should be studying as such. And on the other hand, we have studies that measure threat, asking how important do you find this issue, or how concerned are you about this? So there's a lot of overlap in how we're dealing with it right now, and that's the gap we're trying to fill, the discriminant validity between them. Okay, don't want to spend too much time on the data set. It's data that we've already been working with. It's the ASCOR 25-year collaborative survey. So we probably have a lot of people in the room that either have worked with it or might work with it. We're analyzing wave 1. So our sample is 2,216 people. Okay, and just to go into the variables, we have 3 items measuring salience, concern, and threat. How important do you consider the following problems facing the Netherlands currently for salience? How concerned are you for the potential consequences for you personally or your personal situation for each of the following problems for concern? And to what extent do you feel threatened by these topics for threat? And we've measured all of these for these 12 issues. I'm not going to go into all of them, but they include a range of issues. For example, the influx of asylum seekers, climate change, and inflation. So we've got measures of salience, concern, and threat for all of these issues. Okay, then we wanted to look at, do they differ? Are they the same? How does the data behave? First of all, I've brought distributions here just to look at the raw data. You'll see here that the distributions of salience in green, concern in red, and threat in blue are slightly different. That's not as important as the fact that the means also differ. So these are significant differences between means that we see here. So for threat, it's the lowest. And threat ratings for climate change are lower than concern ratings, and those are lower than salience ratings. If we take another issue into account, Corona, so COVID-19, we see the same pattern. Once again, salience is higher than concern, is higher than threat. And if we consider all 12 issues, we see the same again. And this also holds when Bonferroni correcting for the bunch of comparisons we just did. So that's the first indication that these aren't the same, right? Because people would otherwise just rate them the same. Yeah, that's it about the distributions, but that's our first indicator. Okay, then we looked at correlations, and the exact correlations here are less relevant than the spread of correlations that you're going to see in a second. So these are correlation coefficients between threat and concern rating for the 12 issues that we looked at. And we see that overall, they correlate pretty highly, above 0.56, I think it was for threat and concern, at least for all issues. So we've got close correlations here, and all issues are relatively similar in the fact that they correlate closely. But if we look at threat and salience, we see that this spread becomes wider and that the correlations are also overall lower. So threat and concern are overall 12 issues more closely associated with each other than threat and salience. And if we look at concern and salience, we see that the spread is slightly larger than that for threat and concern, but that really threat and salience are the least associated with each other. I still want to stress that within each issue, I mean, these are still moderate, right? They're not low. Also, we shouldn't discard them. But threat and concern are more closely associated with each other than threat and salience. All right. Yeah, that's also what I wrote down. Okay, and not to overwhelm you with this is also in no way a confirmative test. This is just a way for now to plot the partial correlations in the systems that we see. So this is a system of threat, concern, and salience plotted separately across these 12 issues. Essentially, we just see that, again, that threat and concern seem more similar in their cognitive representations than salience. Threat and concern seem pretty similar. Salience seems different from that. And what we can also see from the higher amount of negative edges within the salience network is that apparently threat across all 12 issues is a little more predictive of itself than salience might be. Yeah, so that also taps into something like threat sensitivity, but of course we can't infer things like that. Right, and then one thing that we were also thinking, what makes threat special? Well, it's emotional component, right? So salience is essentially more cognitive, you could argue, than threat, probably, or at least that's how we treat it. And luckily, in the data set, we actually had emotion variables, so we are now able to also assess the correlations between those. So we asked, how often during the past week did you feel nervous, anxious, upset, and a bunch of other emotions? Specifically nervous, anxious, upset, dejected and gloomy, and stressed out correlate with each other pretty highly. So I'm summing all of these up into a negative affect emotion composite scale right now. And then we also have happy, enthusiastic, and optimistic. And we're summing all of these up into a positive affect scale. That's just the solution for now. Yeah, nothing is pre-registered, nothing set in stone. Happy to talk about this. Right, but you would, with threat arguably being associated with negative affect, you would expect it to be more closely associated to, you would expect negative affect to be more closely associated to threat than to salience, right? And this is exactly what we find. These are only correlations, and yes, these include confidence intervals, but I also want to say that I want to talk less about significance because then I would have to do a bunch of corrections. Then I want to talk about patterns. We see overall that threat, so this is in blue here, is more associated with negative affect than salience. So this goes both in terms of magnitude of the absolute association and also the direction that you would expect. There's a positive association over all 12 issues between threat and negative affect. And that holds less for salience. And once again, concern is kind of in the middle between the two of them, right? But again, threat and salience are most different. And then if we look at positive affect, we don't find a clearly reversed pattern. But what I find interesting here is specifically that it is mixed. So sometimes positive affect is in magnitude more predictive of salience of these issues, but this also switches around sometimes. But overall, the pattern is still that it's more, a positive effect is more positively associated with salience than it is with threat. So once again, this is within what would make sense here if threat has a more emotional component. Okay, after all of these graphs, what did we learn? So we see that distributions of mean and means of threat, salience, and concern differ, where salience ratings are overall higher than concern ratings, are overall higher than threat ratings. We see that threat, salience, and concern all correlate moderately to strong with each other within societal issues, but that threat and concern correlate most strongly, and threat and salience are the least associated with each other. Within the constructs threat, salience, and concern, the associations between issues have a different pattern for salience than they seem to have for threat and concern. And finally, the associations with negative effect stick out here. So for threat, these associations are larger than for concern, and for both of these larger than they are for salience. But of course, I also want to stress, we're not making an inference about direction here, right? This was all measured within the same data collection. We can't say if it's negative effect driving threat perceptions or if it's threat perceptions driving negative effect. If you ask me over a beer, I would say they probably drive each other. But yeah, we cannot infer that right here. Okay, so in the spirit of a subculture team that asked if something's actually valid, no, it's not just a phase, ma'am, and also, no, it's not just issue salience, ma'am. Okay, thank you for your time.
Yeah.
Thank you, Linda. I'm super excited to see like more of your threat research. I think the first presentation I saw was in February, and now you're further exploring this, and it's super cool to see and obviously relevant and that. My question is, and I'm not sure if I'm also missing something cognitively, but I could imagine that if I'm presented with a list of threats, people probably were in this survey, that you cannot really speak on the absolute threat perceptions, but the relative threat perceptions, right? Because it's quite the overload to be confronted with all the issues that we have in our current lives. So I wonder how this would look different if you had sort of the most important threat, whether it be threatening or salient or what, to each person, compared to keeping all threats from all people for analysis. Does that make sense?
Yeah,
Because you skim this list and you see like, oh, immigration, oh,
yeah,
threat, or whatever, whoever's sitting there, or let it be COVID-19 pandemics, whatever, that then the responses to everything that seems so much less threatening, relatively speaking, because you're confronted with all of it at once. Do you know what I mean? Is that
And yeah, I know what you mean. I'm scared of the modeling that would, that would say, but I know what you mean, like basically a hierarchy of threats, like a pyramid of threats, right? I think we're so in another data collection, we asked both to what extent do you feel threatened by these topics, 1 to 7 Likert scale, like you just saw here, and which of these topics is the most threatening to you. So asked in a separate item. That, well, the overlap of that was shocking for me, but I haven't been in research long. Maybe others would have been less shocked. But, you know, sometimes people didn't give the topic that they actually indicated later in the separate item as the most threatening topic, the highest score. But what that also really showed us was that the influx of asylum seekers overall always gets a relatively low threat score if you just calculate a mean, at least on this sample that I've been overworking. And then at the same time, in the other sample that we collected, it was the threat score, the threat mean was low, but among the categorical measurement that we did, threat was the mode. Influx of asylum seekers was the mode. It was when we asked people which of these is the most threatening to you, the largest, the amount of people who chose the influx of asylum seekers was the biggest group. But at the same time, if we just calculated means, it didn't even make it into the ranking of the top 3. So some people, that just means some people are super threatened by the influx of asylum seekers, and then the larger majority is spread over other issues, right? This is the best answer I can come up with to your question that I know was sort of about something else, but like, yeah.
Question. It was also just I don't know, yeah.
But I agree. I think there's
fair. Yeah.
like there's also probably differences, right? If we just let people rank, if we were to just let people rank these, the differences between each first, second, third, fourth rank would differ vastly by person. So I can find something much more threatening. Like I can have a huge difference between rank one and 2 versus somebody else who finds these similarly. Yeah.
Did
Yeah.
you ask about the emotions before or after?
Ooh, survey flow wise, they're at the end of the data set.
Yeah. No, that is usually.
But other than that, don't know. Yeah. Thanks.
Oh, thanks. Oh, what cool, rich data. And also, I noticed that the radical right is correct, that the World Economic Forum has infiltrated our university. It's our guiding document up here. So I was wondering what's behind those correlations. And I was thinking also what's maybe another way to think about it maybe as a combination of answers or even an item response theory way. Because I think you can find something salient but not feel threatened by it. But say you're extremely threatened by something and then say you don't find it salient or you're not concerned. Even if that might happen in reality, it's harder to tell somebody, right? It feels like internally incoherent. So I can imagine that that might be somewhat behind this correlation, but I'm not sure whether that's true. And at some point, I guess also expressive answering kicks in, right? If you find something extremely salient and you're very concerned, you might want to say you're also threatened, right? So I'm sure that's part of your broader story, but just these combinations of those who are below or above the midpoint or something on these really maybe end up with some sort of problem where you can find something salient but not the other two. But once you have one of the other two, you also have to find it salient or something like it. And then maybe you can use IRT or something to come up with some sort of ladder of how you relate to the topic.
Yeah, very.
I'm sure the World Economic Forum likes that, but
I'll have to call. Yeah. No, that's a really great point. Intuitively, but that's also me studying threat and therefore maybe overvaluing threat. I think intuitively, threat might be the highest here. And I mean, that's kind of overall, people find things more salient than they find them threatening, right? And I always wonder also, I don't think I've looked at that. I wonder personal answer tendencies. How willing are you to admit that something is threatening? Could that also correlate with exactly the issues that we're researching with these items? Because that could then also be an issue. Admitting that you're threatened is super vulnerable. Versus this is important. Less so it's less personal. I wrote down the thing about IoT. I think that's a really good point. Yeah, thank you.
What's the name?
Thank you, Linda. Really great presentation. So thinking about how all these threats are very polarized, I was wondering how ideology might factor into understanding these different categories.
Yeah, well, that's also the central question we're asking ourselves, right, for 4 years. Yes, so before we ran this with these correlations at the end with emotions, we actually ran them with, I also have the variables in touch. We ran them with political ideology on a left-right spectrum. So we've got two ideology variables in the data set, both political orientation left-right and conservative progressive. Consistently, we've been much more successful with the left-right ideology, got to say. So this is what we found over there. Essentially, for salience, we have a bigger magnitude here, is what I took away from these. And I want to stress that all of these are always single item measurements, right? So I wouldn't trust a single one of these graphs, but the pattern that we see across all of these. So what we see is that for salience ratings versus threat ratings, ideology seems to matter more for the salience ratings. One thing that sticks out as interesting, but again, single item measurement, is that the only issue where it's reversed seems to be the influx of asylum seekers. Again, like what I just said about the mode, this has been the item this has been the topic that's been behaving differently consistently around a lot of data collections that we've done. But yeah, that's what I found super interesting, that for when we compare the associations with political ideology and with emotions, political ideology seems to be more closely associated with salience of issues, versus negative effect seems to be more closely associated with threat ratings, threat perceptions of issues. But there's much more you could disentangle here, and we're back to the question of causality and the whole wheel that keeps spinning. But yeah, thanks.
Question. I wanted to actually bring us back to the beginning of your story, and it sort of relates to what Elko was talking about. So what is this paper about? Because you set it up as arguing against the sort of incorrect use of issue salience, right? And I am not sure whether this problem actually is there. Maybe it is, but I would need to be more convinced that we use it for the same purposes. And then that needs to be grounded in some theory that you skipped in the beginning of your presentation. But if I think about more psychological theory, then I would say they have never talked about issue salience as what you measure with issue salience. It was always about the salience to you. And I think it would be about the relevant. I think they call it relevance, the relevance to you. And then we go back to like the 70s, 80s, old school psychology with I think it was called elaboration likelihood model. So how do people process information, right? And I don't think they would ever talk about salience as you do. Maybe political scientists do, and then you can hook it, to that debate. But maybe it's actually not about that. Maybe it's more the direction that Elko is suggesting, distinguishing between them and how they are related, and then creating some construct validity for our tool to measure threat perception, right? Yeah. So it's more about how you frame it now with this great data that you have, so that you have a higher chance to not offend the reviewers.
Yeah, no, it's always good to get the reviewer to comment as early as possible.
Right.
So that's really good. Thanks. And we are indeed planning on submitting to a site journal over politics. So this is much appreciated.
Actually placing it somewhere else.
Yeah. Thank you. Yeah, the issue salience issue, I've written that down.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yes, I was gonna ask. And also now, actually, recently with the asylum debate as well, and everything that was happening in the Dutch Parliament with is it a crisis or is it not?
Hmm.
I was just wondering whether you have anything to say about how accurate threat perceptions actually are.
Ooh.
I understand that's really hard because how do you measure whether we're threatened by climate change or whichever, but across any sort of, topic, is there anything to be said about how accurate people actually perceive certain threats?
Well, with this data, no. And also with other data, not directly, but what I can say is that they're stable, right? That's what we found in a previous investigation of the same data, but then looking at all 6 waves. And this is an argument that I'm saying as I'm developing it, so don't quote me. But if threat perceptions are super stable over the course of 1 year, which included the fall of a government and re-election, which our data set stands, then probably no, right? Probably they're still super subjective, and then, well, emotions are inherently subjective, so maybe threat perceptions in terms of emotions, yes, they are correct because they're correct to you, they're accurate to you. But do they reflect recent developments? No, because we found way more stability than I really would have thought we would. Yeah, so I would say ultimately it's extremely subjective. Yeah. Actually, I'll run this again for salience and concern. Thanks. Yeah.
More about questions there, maybe you first. Showing.
Okay. Yeah, thanks. Very impressive. I was at some point you said you talked about salience, and then you said something about threat sensitivity. And I was wondering, could it maybe also relate to the filter bubble in the sense that something, for example, when I started my PhD, I started to read the Telegraph, which is a newspaper I've never read before. Sorry?
Did Rens force you to do this?
I would rather force Rens.
Oh, yeah. That's a good idea.
But yeah, somehow the royal family became a lot more salient in my so to that, I always see framing as a multifaceted thing. So you have like selection bias, the coverage bias, and then the framing bias, like the statement bias. How is something actually formulated? And in terms of the selection bias, you see a difference between newspapers, right? So therefore, I was wondering whether you have some kind of information, like primary source of information in your data set that could maybe like show that, okay, but this newspaper sheds more light on this than the other newspaper. Might overcomplicate things. I think your study is already very telling as it is, but that maybe gives another layer of depth to it. Yeah, I mean, it's super interesting. We kind of moved away from news consumption after we found very few associations with threat in the first study that we ran, but we didn't look at this with the same methods for issue salience or importance, as I could also call it, and concern, right? So this might hold even more. Would make it really interesting if we could find more associations between issue salience than threat, but also then we would have to run a type of content exploration or content analysis for the data collection wave, which would be possible, but yeah, of course, a lot of work, but it would be really interesting. Because we talk about framing a lot, and we also talk about threat framing, but then again, framing from news media has been most connected to connected to salience a lot, right? So it would be interesting to disentangle these two and to see which type of news content affects which ratings more. Yeah. I'm also not sure if you will find anything. Yeah. Thanks though.
We have a little bit more time to show.
I think Honorata has already partially asked about this. Could you just go back to the way the questions that you asked for salience and for threat and concern? Yes. So you asked about how important do you consider the following problems facing? Okay, so it is for the individual, but of course people could think of importance as being something that is understood through the perspective of collective, while they could look at being concerned and threatened as more of an individual experience. So I was thinking that maybe people for salience ratings, they kind of decide based on, let's say, like semantics that are shared amongst a lot of people, like what do people in general find to be an important subject versus something like concern, which is more like am I really concerned?
Yeah.
I was wondering if the reason why salience could be a bit more different might be because it's more distributed, like distributed perception that you try to average versus threat, which is much more just your own perception of it.
Much more personal, yeah.
Yeah.
You're tapping into something that we've also been discussing while writing it up. So what I marked in bold are important, concerned, and threatened, but you could also shed light on different aspects of these questions, right? Problems facing the Netherlands, consequences for you personally, you feel threatened. This is also another distinction, another difference between these items. Yeah, and with my main conclusion being asking about importance for a country is different than negative emotions for you. I think we should, as next steps, or I don't know, us or somebody else, disentangle a more clear framing of, is it the emotion framing? Is it the importance versus threat, importance versus negative emotion word that makes you respond differently? Or is it who you consider for this? Because yeah, it's also always possible that we never know what's going on the side of inside the head of survey respondents. They might always try to be the perfect meta insightful person. When I'm asking them to what extent do you feel threatened, they might think, oh, I think people are threatened.
Oh.
Yeah, it's the same. Yeah, so I think that should be another thing that we should disentangle. Yeah, and unfortunately with this phrasing, we can't clearly do it on this data.
And a very short final question.
Hello.
I have a question about the different issues. And just by looking at them, I think there's different threats in play. But also, are you considering any kind of group dynamics? Because some of them could elicit kind of intergroup threat, immigration, for instance, to a certain extent. And then also different threats in terms of material, survival threats. That's something also mentioned in the group threat here. So I don't know if you also consider that, or you want to discuss it.
Yeah, this again ties into the first project that I ran on these, where I desperately tried to find and argue for a clustering solution that lets me actually maybe develop a taxonomy of them, and ultimately had to throw up my hands and say, no, not in this data, not with my methods. So reading this, I agree with you. Yes, of course, there are economic threats in there. There are threats to national security in there. There are threats that differ in terms of how much empathy towards strangers does it require for you to find this threatening. The inhumane reception of asylum seekers is not super relevant to you as a threat if you're not an asylum seeker. So yes, these differ on all sorts of constructs. With the previous analyses that we ran, I didn't find a stable clustering solution on this data. But yeah, it is a good point, and it's definitely something that we'll have to discuss at least in this paper. Thanks.